The night the city burned gold was the night Audrey Sinclair's life changed forever. Downtown Los Angeles was alive. Music pulsed from every doorway. Laughter spilled like champagne, and the air smelled of heat and neon. Audrey stood outside the Velvet Room, gripping her thrifted clutch, her breath trembling as if the city itself were watching her. She told herself she didn't belong here, and yet fate had already written her name on this night. Inside everything was a blur of bodies and bass. The lights painted her skin bronze, the kind of glow she never saw under the fluorescent buzz of the diner she'd just been fired from. Her friend Mia shoved a glass into her hand. "Come on, girl, one drink won't kill you. You deserve a night off from life." Audrey hesitated. She wasn't much of a drinker, but the pressure in her chest, the exhaustion of surviving, made her lift the glass anyway. The liquid burned her throat, sweet and dangerous. Moments later, the room spun. Her vision shimmered like broken glass. She pressed her hand against the bar, whispering, "Something's not right." Then she felt a hand, steady firm, catch her elbow before she fell. "Hey, easy," a voice said, deep and calm. "You shouldn't be alone like this." She blinked through the haze. The man before her looked like he belonged on a magazine cover, tall, blue-eyed, with a kind of effortless authority that made the world bend around him. His white shirt was rolled at the sleeves, and his cologne was clean crisp, like rain on asphalt. "I think someone spiked your drink," he said, his jaw tightening. "Let me get you out of here." The last thing she remembered before everything went dark was the way he looked at her, not like a stranger, but like someone who'd just found something he'd lost a long time ago. When Audrey woke up, the world was silent, except for the hum of an engine. She was lying in the back seat of a car, leather interior, tinted windows, the scent of expensive cologne everywhere. Her head throbbed. Her hands trembled as she touched her clothes, still on, but disheveled, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echo. Panic surged. What happened? She pushed the door open and stumbled out onto the side street, the morning air cold against her skin. Behind her, the man stirred awake in the driver's seat, eyes heavy confusion etched into his features. "Wait, hey!" he called out, but she was already running barefoot, tears blurring her sight. She didn't even know his name. 2 weeks later, the Los Angeles sun baked the cracked pavement outside the Clark estate. Audrey stared up at the gates, her cheap suitcase trembling in her hand. Her cousin had gotten her a job here, temporary housekeeping, she'd said. Audrey didn't know it yet, but fate was circling back for her. The mansion was all glass and steel, perched over the city like a promise. Inside, everything gleamed marble floors, golden light art that looked too perfect to be touched. An older housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, greeted her with a smile. "You must be the new girl." "Audrey Wright. Welcome to Clark Estate." Audrey nodded nervously. "Yes, ma'am. I'll do my best." "Good. The owner just got back from New York this morning. Try not to be in his way, he hates noise." Audrey forced a smile. Understood. But inside, her stomach twisted. She didn't know why the name Clark made her pulse skip. She unpacked in the staff quarters, a simple but cozy room. The house was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. As she wandered through the corridors, dusting picture frames and setting fresh flowers, she paused before a massive glass wall overlooking the hills. For a moment, she imagined what it must feel like to live here, untouchable, free. Then a voice echoed behind her. "Who told you to come in here?" Audrey spun around and froze. It was him. The man from that night, David Clark. Her throat went dry. Her fingers went numb around the feather duster. For a heartbeat, she thought he recognized her, those sharp blue eyes studying her, searching. But then he just frowned slightly. "You're new," Yes, sir, she whispered, trying to steady her voice. His gaze lingered on her face. Something flickered there. Confusion, curiosity, maybe a ghost of memory. I've seen you somewhere before, he murmured. Her pulse roared in her ears. I don't think so, sir. I just started today. He didn't answer. He only looked at her one last time before walking past, the faint scent of his cologne trailing behind, like the echo of a dream. When he disappeared around the corner, Audrey's knees gave out. She gripped the edge of a table, whispering to herself, "Oh my God, what have I done?" That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face again. The same man whose touch had steadied her in the darkness. The same man she'd fled from in shame. Now he was her employer. And worse, he didn't remember. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering into the stillness, "Maybe that's for the best. Maybe I can just pretend it never happened." But the truth burned under her skin. The memory of that night wasn't something she could erase. It had a heartbeat of its own, one that pulsed louder with every second she spent under his roof. Somewhere outside, the city lights flickered against the glass. Inside, Audrey curled up in her narrow bed, a single tear tracing down her cheek. She didn't know that in the master suite across the hall, David Clark was standing by his window, staring out into the same night, a frown on his lips, an ache he couldn't name tightening in his chest. He didn't know why, but something about the new maid's eyes wouldn't leave his mind. Sometimes the people you're meant to forget are the ones destiny keeps putting in your path. If this story touched your heart, don't leave just yet. There's more waiting. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and stay with Audrey and David as their tangled hearts find their way home. The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of the Clark estate, gilding the marble floors with soft gold. Audrey adjusted her apron nervously as she followed Mrs. Reynolds through the endless hallways. Every room gleamed, every surface reflected perfection, but Audrey felt out of place, like a misplaced note in a flawless symphony. "Your section will be the East Wing," Mrs. Reynolds said, her tone brisk but kind. "You'll take care of the guest rooms and the private library. And Audrey, don't disturb Mr. Clark unless he calls for you. He values silence." "Yes, ma'am," Audrey replied softly. Her heart thudded when the woman said his name. Mr. Clark. Just hearing it made her chest tighten. She had spent all night convincing herself that he hadn't recognized her, that she could pretend to be someone else, someone clean, invisible, ordinary. By mid-morning, she was polishing the wooden shelves in the library, her movements careful and deliberate. The scent of lemon oil and old paper filled the air, calming her slightly. Books lined the walls like silent witnesses, law, architecture, business art. And somewhere among them, a single photograph stood framed on a shelf, a young David Clark, smiling faintly, beside a man who must have been his father. He looked different, then softer, more human. The man she met last night, however, had walls in his eyes. Audrey leaned closer, her fingertip brushing the glass. "Who were you before the world made you so cold?" she whispered, not realizing the door behind her had opened. "I might ask you the same thing," came that low, controlled voice that made her blood run cold. She froze, spinning around. David stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a file. His shirt sleeves were rolled up again, veins visible along his forearm, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Clark." Relax," he said, setting the file down on the desk. "You looked like you were about to interrogate my photograph." "I was just dusting," she said, quickly lowering her gaze. "Do you always whisper to furniture when you clean?" She blinked, cheeks burning. I talk to myself sometimes. It helps me focus. He smirked faintly, the corner of his mouth curving in a way that made her knees weaken. And what were you asking exactly? Nothing important, sir. David studied her for a long moment. The air between them thickened with something neither of them dared to name. He took a step closer, not enough to touch her, but enough for her to feel the pull of his presence. Do I make you nervous? Audrey's throat tightened. No, sir. Liar. His voice softened, teasing, but his eyes were piercing, as if trying to peel away her composure. She forced herself to meet his gaze. If I may, sir, I'd like to finish my work. He didn't move. You can. He turned away at last, the faintest ghost of a smile on his lips. Just don't talk to the books. They might start answering. Her breath escaped in a shaky laugh as he left the room. When the door closed, Audrey pressed a hand against her chest. God help me, she whispered. He's going to be the end of me. That evening, the mansion shimmered under the city lights. Audrey carried trays of dinner to the dining room where Mrs. Reynolds and the other staff served with quiet precision. But David wasn't at the table. His chair remained empty. He's been in his study all day, one of the staff whispered. Probably another investor crisis. Audrey nodded, setting down a plate of salmon. She told herself she didn't care. Yet her eyes kept flicking toward the hallway that led to his office as though drawn by gravity. When the others left to clean the kitchen, she lingered near the dining room, hesitating. Something in her, the same foolish part that had made her drink that night, pushed her forward. She found herself standing before the heavy oak door of his study. The light inside glowed faintly through the frosted glass. She raised her hand, knocked once. Come in? His voice called low and tired. Audrey entered quietly. David sat behind his desk, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled higher, hair slightly tousled. There were papers everywhere, contracts, blueprints, numbers scribbled in the margins. He looked up, surprised. Miss Sinclair? She swallowed. Dinner's ready, sir. Mrs. Reynolds said you haven't eaten. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. I lost track of time again. Thank you. She nodded, unsure whether to leave or stay. He gestured toward the tray in her hands. Put it down. You might as well sit for a minute. I'm not as terrifying as people say. Her lips curved slightly. I think you enjoy being terrifying, sir. Perhaps he said, amused. It keeps the world predictable. Audrey hesitated, then sat across from him, folding her hands neatly on her lap. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. David studied her again, the curve of her jaw, the quiet dignity in her posture. Something about her unsettled him. There was gentleness, yes, but also an ache, a sadness that mirrored his own. You're not from L.A., are you? He asked. No, sir. Georgia. Why come all the way here? She looked down. Because sometimes the farther you run, the easier it is to forget. David's brows lifted. Forget what? Audrey smiled faintly, a sad curve of her lips. Mistakes. People. Versions of yourself that didn't survive. He didn't expect that answer. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Finally, he murmured, You sound like someone who's seen too much for her age. Maybe I have, she said softly. When she stood to leave, he caught her wrist gently, not possessively, just enough to make her look back. Miss Sinclair, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Have we met before? Her breath caught. She could feel the pulse hammering beneath her skin, where his fingers touched. I don't think so, sir. She lied again, eyes wide and wet under the lamplight. He held her gaze a second longer, before letting go. You remind me of something I can't quite name. She smiled faintly. Maybe you just need rest. Maybe, he said, but his eyes didn't leave her until she slipped out the door. Later that night, Audrey wandered into the garden after finishing her chores. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of jasmine. The city glittered far below as if every light were a secret waiting to be told. She sat on a stone bench hugging her knees. Why can't I stop thinking about him? She thought. Why does he make me feel seen when I'm trying so hard to disappear? Behind her, the glass doors slid open. I didn't expect anyone out here, David's voice said quietly. She turned, startled. He was in a dark sweater now, barefoot on the patio stones, holding a glass of whiskey. He looked different, softer, human. I just needed some air, she said. He nodded, walking closer. I usually come out here when I can't sleep. Does that happen often every night? He gave a half smile. Running a company doesn't exactly invite peace of mind. Audrey looked away. Peace feels like a luxury these days. Do you ever stop working? He asked, sitting beside her. She shook her head. People like me don't get to stop. Something flickered in his eyes. Guilt maybe, or understanding. Then maybe people like me should learn how to. For a while they just sat there in silence, the sound of crickets filling the space between them. Then David said quietly, You know I can't shake the feeling that I know you. There's something about your eyes. Audrey turned to him, her heart in her throat. Sometimes she whispered, It's better not to remember. Why? Because remembering hurts. David looked at her, and in that moment, all the distance between wealth and poverty, power and weakness, vanished. There were only two souls, both running from ghosts they couldn't name. His voice was a murmur. Maybe some things are meant to hurt. That's how we know they were real. Audrey's eyes shimmered under the moonlight. She stood up abruptly, afraid of what she might say next, afraid of what her heart might betray. Good night, Mr. Clark. He watched her walk away, the hem of her dress brushing the grass, her shadow melting into the darkness. When she disappeared inside, David lifted his glass toward the stars, whispering to no one, Who are you, Audrey Sinclair? And in the silent mansion beyond the glass, her name lingered, like the aftertaste of something sweet and dangerous, something neither of them could ever forget. It was almost midnight when Audrey found herself standing alone in the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the cavernous mansion. Everyone else had gone to bed hours ago, but her body refused to rest. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the fridge, the soft light spilling over her tired face. Inside, she spotted a box of leftover pizza, her secret indulgence since she started working here. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, At least you never judge me. Pulling out the box, she sat on the cold tiled floor, her back resting against the cabinet. The first bite was comfort, warm and familiar. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the world blur away. But peace, as always, was fleeting. A voice, deep, unhurried, unmistakable, broke through the quiet. Couldn't sleep either. The box slipped from her hands. She looked up, startled. David Clark stood by the doorframe, his silhouette outlined by the soft light from the fridge. He wore a gray t-shirt and joggers, barefoot, his hair slightly tousled, as if he'd been running a hand through it for hours. Sorry, sir, she stammered, scrambling to stand. I didn't mean to relax. He crossed the floor, every step measured. I just didn't expect to find anyone stealing my midnight snack. Audrey's cheeks flushed. I wasn't stealing. I was just hungry. He chuckled quietly, opening the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. Good. I'd hate to think I employ criminals. The air between them thickened, charged but delicate, like the edge of a storm. She watched him take a sip, his Adam's apple moving slowly, the muscles in his neck flexing. She turned away quickly, forcing herself to breathe. "Do you always eat on the floor?" he asked, amused. She glanced down, embarrassed. "It's quiet down here. Feels less lonely." Lonely. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "In a house full of people." Audrey shrugged. "It's not the number of people that matters, sir. Sometimes you can be surrounded by 100 voices and still feel like no one hears you." David's smile faded. "You'd be surprised how much I understand that." Something in his tone softened her. She hesitated, then asked quietly, "Is that why you can't sleep?" He met her gaze, the weight of his eyes making her pulse quicken. "Maybe. Or maybe it's because my mind doesn't know how to shut off. It keeps replaying moments, faces I can't forget, decisions. I wish I could." Audrey's fingers tightened on the edge of the pizza box. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," he said simply. "And what about you, Miss Sinclair? What keeps you awake at night?" Her lips parted, but words tangled in her throat. If he only knew the weight she carried, the secret that sat just beneath her heartbeat. "Dreams," she said finally. "Ones I'm not ready to face." David tilted his head slightly, studying her, as though she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You're a very strange woman. I'll take that as a compliment," she murmured, the ghost of a smile on her lips. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked softly on the far wall. Then, as if drawn by something invisible, David crouched down beside her. The scent of him, clean, woodsy, and faintly smoky, wrapped around her like warmth. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the pizza. She blinked in surprise. "You eat leftover pizza?" He smiled. "You'd be shocked how human I am." He reached for a slice, their fingers brushing for an instant. It was nothing, just skin against skin, but the jolt that shot through her made her heart stutter. She pulled her hand back, pretending to focus on her food, though she couldn't taste a thing. David took a bite, then laughed under his breath. "This is terrible." Audrey's head snapped up. "Hey, that's my dinner. It's cold, chewy, and tragic." He teased, his eyes gleaming. "Then don't eat it," she retorted, folding her arms. He grinned. "I didn't say I'd stop." The sound of his laughter, low, unguarded, was something she'd never heard before. It stripped away the layers of the businessman, the billionaire, the man people feared. For a brief, fragile moment, he was just David, and somehow that made it harder to breathe. "You know," he said quietly after a moment, "you're different from most people here." "How so?" "They walk like the ground belongs to me. You walk like you own your own sky." Her heart skipped. Maybe that's because my sky doesn't cost anything. He smiled faintly, but there was admiration in his eyes. "Keep it that way." They sat there for a while, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about the sound of New York rain, how he missed its rhythm. She spoke about Georgia summers, about the smell of rain on red clay and magnolia trees. Each word bridged a distance neither of them had meant to cross. Then, somewhere between laughter and silence, something shifted. Audrey reached to close the pizza box, and David's hand landed on hers again, accidental, but this time, neither moved away. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Audrey." She felt the air tremble. "Yes. Have we met before?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to lie again, to hide behind the same quiet wall she'd built since that night. But his voice was different now, gentle, unsure, the kind of tone that made her want to tell the truth. Still, she forced a smile. No, sir, we haven't. David searched her face as if trying to read the spaces between her words. Then, almost reluctantly, he pulled back. Strange. I could swear I've seen you somewhere. Maybe I just remind you of someone, she said softly. Maybe. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable anymore. It was electric, alive, pulsing with everything they weren't saying. David stood up first, running a hand through his hair. You should get some rest. You've got a long day tomorrow. She nodded, standing slowly. Good night, Mr. Clark. David. He corrected his back, still to her. Audrey froze. Sir. He turned, a faint smile curving his lips. When it's just the two of us, call me David. She hesitated, the sound of his name catching on her tongue like something forbidden. Good night, David. His gaze lingered a moment longer before he left the kitchen, his footsteps fading down the hall. Later, as Audrey lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replayed every second of that encounter. The light in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the way her name had sounded when he said it. She pressed her hands to her chest, as if to calm the wild rhythm beneath her ribs. She told herself it meant nothing. He was her employer. He was kind, maybe even lonely. But kindness had a dangerous way of becoming something else, and she couldn't afford to let her heart forget the truth. Yet somewhere in the quiet of her thoughts, a memory flickered, the night of the bar, the warmth of his hand on her back, the way his voice had whispered her name in the dark. And for the first time since that night, Audrey let herself wonder if maybe, just maybe, fate wasn't finished with them yet. Across the hall, David sat in his study staring out at the Los Angeles skyline. The city glowed below him, alive and merciless. He had meetings in the morning, calls to return deals waiting on his signature. But all he could think about was the woman in his kitchen, eating cold pizza, like it was the only thing keeping her heart intact. He'd seen countless faces in his life, beautiful, ambitious, hollow, but hers stayed. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, something that tugged at a place he didn't know still existed. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and whispered into the empty room, Audrey Sinclair. Who are you really? The clock ticked softly, the night deepened, and somewhere between guilt and longing, the first sparks of something dangerous began to take shape, something neither of them would be able to stop once it began. The morning came softly, sunlight spilling across the glass walls of the Clark estate like a quiet confession. Audrey awoke before the rest of the house, as she always did, the rhythm of her days carved by discipline and silence. She moved through the corridors barefoot, her reflection following her in the gleaming marble floors. Yet that morning, her steps were slower. The world swayed beneath her feet, her vision clouding for a brief second. She reached for the wall, pressing her palm against the cold surface to steady herself. A strange wave of dizziness washed over her, followed by the sharp sting of nausea. She barely made it to the staff restroom before she was on her knees, retching into the sink. Her hands trembled as she turned on the faucet, the rush of water masking the sound of her quick, uneven breaths. She stared at herself in the mirror, pale skin, wide eyes, fear blooming in her chest like an unwelcome seed. No, she whispered, gripping the counter. It can't be. But deep down, something in her already knew. The late nights, the sudden exhaustion, the quiet hunger that crept in waves, it all came together like puzzle pieces forming an image she wasn't ready to see. She sank onto the cool tiles, her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted to deny it, to pretend it was stress or fatigue, but the truth pressed against her ribs with each breath. The memory of that night, the one she'd buried so deep, flashed behind her eyelids. The heat, the trembling hands, his voice whispering her name, as if it were sacred. David Clark. The name alone was enough to make her throat tighten. She covered her face, her tears spilling freely now. What am I going to do? By afternoon, she was in the garden pruning roses, just to keep her shaking hands busy. The sun was too bright, the air too heavy. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her work cut, gather breathe, but her mind refused to obey. "You've been quiet today," came a familiar voice from behind her. She froze. The sound of his voice always had that effect on her. David stood a few feet away, dressed casually, in a white button-down, with the sleeves rolled up, his watch glinting in the light. He had that look again, half curiosity, half concern. "Just tired, sir," she said quickly, keeping her eyes on the roses. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her hands. "I told you, David, when it's just us." Her breath hitched. I'm sorry. It's a hard habit to break." He smiled faintly. "You seem pale. Are you feeling all right?" She straightened, forcing a small laugh. "I'm fine. I think the heat's just getting to me." David studied her face. "You don't look fine." For a moment she thought he might reach out and touch her, his hand lifting slightly before he caught himself. He stepped back instead, his jaw tightening. "You should take the rest of the day off." "I can't. Mrs. Reynolds needs me to finish." "That's an order, Audrey," he said gently, but his voice carried authority, leaving no room for argument. "Go rest." She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." When she walked past him, her shoulder brushed his arm. It was only a second, but it was enough. The contact left an echo-electric, dangerous, impossible to ignore. David turned slightly as she walked away, his gaze following her, until she disappeared through the archway of the garden. His chest felt oddly tight, the same ache that had haunted him for weeks. He didn't understand it, but every time she left a room, something in him felt missing. That night, the rain came unexpectedly soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the windows. Audrey sat on the edge of her bed, her hands resting on her stomach. She hadn't eaten all day. Her body was trembling, her heart torn between fear and disbelief. She reached for her phone, the old one with the cracked screen, and opened the web browser. Her fingers typed slowly, "Early pregnancy symptoms." The words on the screen blurred as she read, her tears falling silently. Everything matched. The dizziness, the nausea, the sensitivity to smell. The dates lined up too perfectly to ignore. Her hands drifted down to her belly, pressing lightly as if she might feel something there. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The thunder outside rolled low and distant, like the growl of a warning. She couldn't stay here. Not in this house. Not under his roof. If he ever found out, he'd think she was trying to trap him. The thought of seeing pity, or worse, suspicion in his eyes, made her stomach twist harder than the morning sickness ever could. A knock on her door startled her. Audrey. Her cousin Lila, the other maid, peeked in. "You missed dinner. Are you okay?" Audrey forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a headache." Lila frowned. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm just tired." "Really?" Lila studied her a moment longer, then sighed. "All right, but eat something before you sleep. You can't live on coffee and air." When the door closed, Audrey let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled as she whispered to herself, "I need to leave." The next morning, her plan was simple. She'd finish her shift pack quietly and disappear before anyone noticed. She'd find a small town, maybe go back to Georgia, start again. It was the only way. But fate, as always, had its own ideas. Around noon, Mrs. Reynolds asked her to deliver a tray of documents to David's office. Audrey's stomach turned at the thought, but she couldn't refuse. Her fingers shook as she balanced the tray and knocked. "Come in," came his voice. The moment she stepped inside, the air seemed heavier. He was standing by the window speaking into his phone, his back to her. His voice was clipped businesslike. "I don't care what the board thinks, Jonathan. Tell them to review the numbers again. We don't cut staff. We find a better strategy." "Understood." He hung up and turned toward her. "Audrey." His tone softened immediately. "You brought these." "Yes, sir." She placed the tray on his desk, her hands trembling slightly. He noticed. "You're shaking." "It's nothing. I just didn't sleep much." He stepped closer. "You've been saying that a lot lately." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the dizziness returned. The room swayed, her vision dimmed, and the next thing she knew, the tray clattered to the floor. David was there in an instant, catching her before she hit the ground. "Audrey." "Hey, look at me." Her body went limp against him, her head resting against his shoulder. She heard his heartbeat steady and strong as her world faded to black. When she woke, the first thing she felt was warmth, the softness of a blanket, the scent of clean linen. The second was the awareness that someone was sitting beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, and there he was. David leaning forward in a chair, elbows on his knees, worry etched across his face. "Hey," he said softly. "You scared the hell out of me." She blinked, disoriented. "What happened?" "You fainted," he said. "The doctor came by, said you're dehydrated, exhausted." "The doctor," her voice shook. "You called?" "Of course I did," he said firmly. "You passed out in my office, Audrey. What was I supposed to do? Ignore it." She turned her face away, staring at the window. Rain streaked down the glass like tears she couldn't shed. "I told you I was fine," she whispered. "And I told you I don't believe," that he countered gently. The silence stretched. The air between them felt fragile, as if one wrong word would shatter it completely. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I should go, David." His eyes darkened. "Go where?" "Somewhere else. I don't belong here." He stood, the movement abrupt. "Is this about me?" "No," she said quickly, though her voice trembled. "This is about me needing to breathe." He took a step closer. "You're hiding something." She looked at him, then really looked at him. His face was so close, his expression torn between frustration and something deeper, something dangerously tender. "Don't do this," she whispered. "Do what? Make me say things I can't take back." David's voice lowered. "Maybe I want to hear them anyway." Her heart twisted. She could feel the tears threatening again, but she blinked them back. "Please," she said softly, "don't make this harder than it already is." For a long moment he said nothing. The rain outside grew louder, filling the silence between them. Finally, his hand lifted, hesitant, trembling, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You don't have to run," he said quietly. "Whatever this is, you don't have to face it alone." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But her secret pulsed beneath her skin, fragile and impossible. When he turned to leave, she pressed her palm against her stomach and whispered so softly he couldn't hear. "You already are." He paused at the door, glancing back one last time. "Get some rest, Audrey. Please." When he was gone, she let the tears fall freely. The truth was no longer just hers to carry, and sooner or later it would find its way to him. The morning after the rain carried a strange kind of stillness, the kind that made every sound sharper, every silence heavier. Audrey woke to the faint scent of lavender on the sheets and the soft murmur of the mansion coming back to life. The doctor was gone. Mrs. Reynolds had resumed her steady rhythm in the kitchen, and David hadn't spoken to her since last night. She lay there for a long while, staring at the ceiling. The memory of his hand brushing her cheek haunted her, the gentleness in it, the concern, the unspoken questions beneath his calm. She'd wanted to tell him everything right then, to confess the truth pressing against her ribs. But courage had a way of fading when she needed it most. Finally, she swung her legs out of bed and forced herself to move. The house didn't stop for secrets. By the time she reached the living room, the sound of David's voice echoed faintly from the hallway. She froze. He was on the phone, his tone clipped and restrained, the way it always was when he was trying to hide emotion. "I said I don't want any more press involved in my personal life, Chloe," he said. "We've been over this." Audrey's heart dropped at the name. Chloe. The woman's voice on the other end was sharp and honeyed audible even from where Audrey stood. "You can't avoid it forever, David. People expect us to show up together. We have an image to protect." "An image," he repeated, his voice edged with exhaustion. "You care about the image, Chloe. I care about the truth." There was a long pause, then a sigh. "Is there someone else?" Audrey didn't wait to hear his answer. She turned and slipped quietly toward the back of the house, her chest tightening with every step. She didn't need to hear it. She already knew she didn't belong in his world. Hours passed and she threw herself into work, scrubbing floors that already gleamed, polishing silver that could already reflect her face. But nothing could quiet the storm in her mind. She'd barely noticed when Lila appeared in the doorway holding a stack of linens. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Audrey forced a laugh. "Maybe I have." Lila frowned, setting the linens down. "You're scaring me, Audrey. You're thinner, quieter, pale as paper. What's going on?" Audrey hesitated. "Promise you won't tell anyone." Lila crossed her arms. "Depends on how bad it is." "It's not bad," Audrey whispered. "Just complicated." Lila studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're in trouble, aren't you? Not the kind you think." When Audrey didn't say more, Lila stepped closer, her voice softening. "You can tell me you know. I won't judge." Audrey shook her head, blinking away sudden tears. "I wish it were that simple." She turned away before her cousin could see the tremor in her hands. That evening, while the house quieted for dinner, David found himself standing in the hallway outside her door. He'd come here twice already and turned back both times. Something about what he saw in her eyes yesterday, fear mixed with sadness, had unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. Finally, he exhaled and knocked once. A moment later, her voice came soft but steady. "Come in." She was sitting by the window, the last light of sunset spilling across her face. The sight hit him harder than he expected. She looked fragile and strong all at once, like a flame trapped in glass. "You shouldn't be up," he said gently. "I'm fine," she replied. "You don't have to keep checking on me." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I'm not checking. I'm trying to understand." Her eyes flicked up to his. "Understand what? Why you look at me like you're always one breath away from running." She froze. "You're imagining things. Am I?" His voice lowered the words, slow, deliberate. "Because every time I walk into a room, you tense. Every time I get close, you pull away. But then there are moments like last night, when you look at me as if—" He stopped himself, his throat tightening around the words, as if what she asked, her voice trembling. He met her eyes, "As if you already know me." The silence that followed was sharp like glass, breaking in slow motion. Audrey turned back toward the window, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Maybe you shouldn't try to understand me, David," she said softly. "Some things are better left alone." He took a step closer. "I don't believe that." "Well, maybe you should." Her voice cracked, and before she could stop herself, tears began to spill. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm like this. Everything's just too much. David moved before he could think. His hands found her shoulders firm but gentle. His voice barely above a whisper. Hey, look at me. She didn't. Please, he said, look at me. When she finally lifted her gaze, his heart stuttered. Her eyes shimmered with something raw and unguarded, a vulnerability that undid every wall he'd ever built. You don't have to face it alone, he said quietly. Whatever it is. Her lips parted. You don't understand. Then make me. I can't. Why not? Because it'll change everything. The air between them felt charged, the kind of silence that burns. David's hands dropped slowly from her shoulders, but his gaze never left her. Everything's already changing, he said. You just won't admit it. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled somewhere between truth and fear. He turned to leave, then perhaps sensing that another word might break her completely. His hand touched the doorknob. When she spoke so softly, he almost didn't hear it. I'm leaving. He froze. What, I'm leaving tomorrow? She said, her voice trembling. I've already told Mrs. Reynolds. He turned slowly, disbelief flickering across his face. Why? Because it's better this way. Better for who? For both of us, she whispered. Don't, he said sharply. Don't decide what's best for me. She flinched. David. He crossed the room in 2 strides. You think I don't see it? The way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. The way you keep your distance like touching me might burn you. Her breath hitched. He stood inches away now, his voice dropping to a whisper. Tell me, Audrey, is it me you're afraid of, or yourself? Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might give her away. I'm afraid of what will happen if I stay. And what's that? That I won't be able to lie anymore. The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. David exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with something deeper than anger. Then stop lying, he said. Just tell me what's real. She shook her head, tears spilling freely now. I can't. Please, don't make me. For a long time, neither moved. The storm that had been brewing between them for weeks finally broke, not in thunder, but in the quiet tremor of 2 people who had run out of places to hide. David reached up, brushing away one of her tears with his thumb. Then let me help you, he whispered. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. Her voice was barely a breath. You can't help me, David. Why not? Because you're the reason it happened. The words struck him like lightning, sudden, blinding, irrevocable. He stepped back, eyes wide, as if he'd just seen something he couldn't comprehend. What did you just say? Audrey's hands covered her face. Please don't ask me to say it again. He reached for her wrist, his voice breaking. Audrey, what are you talking about? Her lips trembled. That night, she whispered. The night at the bar. It was you. He froze, the color draining from his face. She forced herself to look at him, her voice shattering into pieces. And now, I'm carrying your child. The room went silent. The rain outside had stopped, but the world felt louder than ever. The rush of blood in his ears, the distant ticking of the clock, the fragile sound of her breathing. David's lips parted, but no sound came. Every word, every thought dissolved under the weight of what she'd just said. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely human. My child. She nodded, tears glistening on her cheeks. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to feel trapped, but I can't keep pretending anymore. He stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time, Not the maid, not the woman he couldn't stop thinking about, but the truth he'd been chasing in the dark without realizing it. David took a slow step forward, his voice breaking in the stillness. "Audrey, look at me." But she turned away, whispering through her tears, "I can't." And before he could stop her, she was gone, leaving him standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by silence and the unbearable weight of everything they had never meant to happen. The night stretched endlessly after she left. David stood in the center of his study, the words she had spoken replaying, again and again, sharp and unreal. "And now, I'm carrying your child." The air seemed to thin around him. He could still smell the faint trace of her perfume, that quiet sweetness that had followed her wherever she went, and it twisted something deep in his chest. His hands, usually steady, now trembled as he sank into the chair behind his desk. A child. His child. It didn't feel real. And yet, somewhere in the deepest corner of his memory, the pieces began to align. The night at the Velvet Room, the woman he'd saved, her frightened eyes, the way her voice had sounded before everything faded into blurred fragments of light and regret. It was her. He dragged a hand over his face. The man who prided himself on control suddenly had none. Every thought he'd buried, every feeling he had tried to suppress, came roaring back. Morning crept in quietly, and with it came the hollow echo of her absence. The house, usually so full of quiet rhythm footsteps doors. The faint hum of life felt unnaturally still. Audrey was gone. David hadn't slept. His mind was a battlefield, between disbelief and longing, between anger and something softer, something dangerously close to love. He found Mrs. Reynolds in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough, her expression steady as always. "Where's Miss Sinclair?" he asked, trying to sound calm. She looked up, surprised. "She left early this morning, sir. Said she was taking a few days off for personal reasons." David's voice hardened. "Did she say where she was going?" "No, sir," Mrs. Reynolds said carefully. But she looked troubled. He exhaled slowly, a muscle in his jaw tightening. "Thank you." He turned and walked out before the woman could say another word. His mind was already made up. By noon, he was behind the wheel of his car, the city stretching endlessly ahead. The storm from the night before had left the streets shining like mirrors. Every red light felt too long, every intersection too wide. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to find her. He tried calling her, but her number was disconnected. He searched the agency that had hired her, only to learn she'd resigned that morning. No forwarding address, no note, just silence. By sunset, he parked near the coast where the air smelled like salt and rain. He stepped out, the wind sharp against his face. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. The kind of helplessness that money, power, or logic couldn't fix. He whispered into the wind, his voice barely audible. "Where did you go, Audrey?" 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of unanswered calls, sleepless nights, and quiet spirals. He buried himself in work during the day, his board members whispering about how distracted he'd become, how uncharacteristically human. At night, he would sit in his darkened living room staring at the half-empty glass of whiskey that no longer numbed anything. And then, one evening, fate decided to intervene. He was at a small grocery store near the outskirts of the city, picking up coffee, something he hadn't done himself in years. He moved through the aisles without focus, until a soft voice reached his ears. "Excuse me, how much are these apples?" It wasn't the voice itself that startled him. It was the way it sounded, the warmth beneath the exhaustion, the trace of gentleness he would know anywhere. He turned. She was there wearing a simple gray dress, her hair tied back, her skin pale, but glowing in a way that took his breath away. Her hands rested lightly on a basket, and beside her stood a woman from the neighborhood smiling kindly. For a moment, David couldn't move. Audrey turned slightly, her eyes meeting his across the aisle. The color drained from her face. The apple she held slipped from her fingers, rolling softly to his feet. "David," she breathed. He stepped closer, each word measured. "You weren't going to tell me where you went." Her throat worked, but no sound came. The woman beside her looked between them, then quietly excused herself. When they were alone, Audrey whispered, "You shouldn't be here. I've been looking for you for 2 weeks. I didn't want you to." "Well, that's unfortunate," he said, voice low but firm. "Because I did." Her eyes filled with tears, but she turned away, pretending to focus on the shelves. "There's nothing left to say." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "You think you can just disappear, and I'll forget? You think I can go back to pretending that night never happened?" She closed her eyes, her voice trembling. "It was one night, David. It doesn't have to mean—" "Don't," he interrupted sharply, then softened. "Don't say it doesn't mean anything. You know that's not true." When she looked at him again, her eyes shimmered with something fragile. "Fear, yes, but also longing. I didn't plan this," she whispered. "I didn't ask for any of it." He took a step closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of her hair. "Neither did I. But here we are." She backed away, her hand instinctively resting over her stomach. His gaze followed the motion, and the truth hit him again, raw, real, undeniable. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. Her lips parted. "Yes." He exhaled, his composure fracturing for the first time. "How far along?" "Most 2 months." He swallowed hard. "You should have told me." "I tried," she said. "But you would have felt responsible. And I didn't want to be another name on your list of mistakes." His voice hardened. "You think that's what this is to me? A mistake?" She hesitated, her shoulders trembling. "You don't even know what you want, David. You're angry at me now. But what happens when reality hits? When people start talking? When Chloe finds out I don't care about Chloe?" "Yes, you do," she said, her voice rising with emotion. "You care about your company, your reputation, your perfect world. I'm not part of that world. I never was." He stared at her for a long, painful moment, then said quietly, "Maybe my world was never perfect to begin with." Her breath caught. He took a slow step forward. "You think I've had everything, but you have no idea how empty it's been. You came into my house and turned silence into something I started to look forward to. You smiled at me when you were terrified. You made me feel—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Alive." The words hung in the air, fragile and trembling. Audrey bit her lip, tears glinting in the corners of her eyes. "Don't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because it'll make it harder to leave." "Then don't leave. I have to." "No, you don't." He took another step, closing the distance between them. "You don't have to run from me, Audrey. Not anymore." Her voice broke. "You don't understand. This isn't about running. This is about surviving." He reached out slowly, hesitating just before touching her. "Then let me help you survive." For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Her body trembled with the weight of everything she'd been holding in, the fear, the shame, the impossible love she'd tried to bury. And then, for the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe. Her forehead rested against his chest, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I'm so scared," she whispered. His arms came around her, careful and protective. "I know," he murmured. "So am I." They stayed like that for a long time, the noise of the world fading around them. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but steady. "I don't want your money," she said quietly, "or your pity." "You'll get neither," he said. "Only what's mine to give. And what's that?" He looked at her, his voice low and certain. "My name, my protection. My heart, if you'll have it." Audrey stared at him, her breath catching the words too heavy, too beautiful to believe. "David," she began, but he stopped her with a soft, steady look. "This isn't about obligation," he said. "It's about what's real. You're carrying a part of me, and whether you like it or not, that means you're not alone anymore." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them shimmered with quiet truth, messy, fragile, alive. Audrey's hand drifted once more to her stomach. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can believe in forever." He smiled faintly. "Then believe in now." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of sea salt through the open door. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed softly against the shore, the sound of something ending and something else just beginning. The days that followed unfolded with a fragile, uncertain rhythm. Audrey had agreed to return to the Clark estate, though not without hesitation. David had insisted not as an order, but as a plea. There had been something in his eyes that day at the grocery store, something raw and pleading that disarmed her resolve. Now she stood once again beneath the high glass ceilings, surrounded by the silence of the mansion she'd tried so hard to forget. Everything looked the same. The polished floors, the quiet hum of distant machinery, the faint echo of footsteps. Yet nothing felt the same. The air itself carried a tension that neither of them knew how to name. Mrs. Reynolds greeted her warmly, though curiosity flickered behind the woman's kind smile. Audrey could feel it, the unspoken questions, the wonder about why she had returned, and what tethered her so tightly to the man upstairs. When she entered her old quarters, everything had been untouched. The vase of dried lavender still sat by the window, brittle and fragrant, as if time itself had been waiting for her. She traced her fingers over the windowsill and whispered softly to the empty room. "You missed me, didn't you, waiter, that evening as dusk began to spill gold across the city?" David found her in the garden, the same garden where he had once told her she looked pale under the sun. She was kneeling beside the rose bushes, wearing a light linen dress, her hair loose and dancing with the breeze. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He simply watched, letting the sight of her wash over him like something sacred. "Those roses were dying when you left," he said finally. Audrey looked up startled. They just needed someone to care for them again. David smiled faintly, stepping closer. "So did I." Her hands stilled. "David." He crouched beside her, the scent of earth and roses blending with the faint trace of her perfume. "I mean it. When you walked away, it was like the house went silent." She tried to deflect. "You have staff friends, business partners. You don't need me to fill that silence." He tilted his head, studying her. "Maybe not, but I wanted you to." The confession hung between them, delicate and dangerous. Audrey lowered her gaze to the soil. "Wanting and needing are different things." "Not always," he murmured. Her breath caught. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because you make it sound like love." He hesitated, then said quietly, "And if it is?" She turned to him, her eyes bright with both fear and longing. "Then it's a mistake. You and I, we don't belong in the same world. You have everything, David. A name that opens doors. A future built from glass and steel. And me, I'm just the girl who cleans the fingerprints off your world." He reached out, brushing dirt from her wrist. Maybe that's why I see you more clearly than anyone else. Her heart twisted. You don't know what you're saying. I do. His voice was low, unshaken. For once, I do. Before she could answer, he stood, offering her his hand. Come on, dinner's ready. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, steady, and for a fleeting second she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could trust that warmth again. The dining room glowed under soft golden light. A storm brewed outside, lightning flickering in the distance like a restless heartbeat. They ate quietly at first, the clinking of silverware punctuating the silence. David set his glass down. You're not eating much. I'm trying, she said, pushing a piece of grilled salmon around her plate. Is it the nausea again? She nodded. It comes and goes. The doctor said it's normal. A brief silence followed. Then David asked softly, Have you thought about names? Her fork froze midair. Names for the baby. Audrey's chest tightened. It's too soon for that. He leaned back, his gaze steady. It's never too soon to think about something that's already real. She forced a smile. You sound so sure of everything. I'm not, he admitted, but I want to be sure of this. Her throat constricted. You don't have to prove anything to me. I'm not doing this to prove anything, he said, voice deep and calm. I'm doing it because I can't imagine you going through this alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The storm was coming closer. When dinner ended, David walked her to the corridor outside her room. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Good night, Audrey, he said softly. Good night, David. He hesitated, his hand brushing the doorframe. If you need anything, anything at all, you know where to find me. She nodded. I do. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. David. He looked back. Why are you doing all this? She asked, her tone trembling with vulnerability. You barely knew me before. Now you act like... She trailed off, searching for the words. Like, I mean something more. He took a step closer, his eyes dark and unflinching. Because you do. Audrey's breath hitched. I don't know when it happened, he said quietly. Maybe it was the night I saw you in that kitchen eating cold pizza like it was a secret worth keeping. Or maybe it was when you looked at me and saw a man instead of a machine. All I know is I stopped being myself the moment you walked into my life. Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head. Don't say that. Why not? Because I don't know how to carry both you and this baby, she whispered. It's too much. He reached for her hand, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, let me carry you. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened just enough to make her look at him. His eyes were fierce, unguarded, the eyes of a man who had nothing left to hide. I don't care what the world says, Audrey. You and this child, you're my family now, and I'm not letting either of you go. Her voice broke. You think it's that easy? No, he said. But for once, I'm willing to fight for something that isn't built on numbers or contracts. I'm fighting for you. The words hit her like a rush of wind, terrifying and beautiful all at once. Her lips parted, but no words came. And for a moment, she simply looked at him, at the man who had gone from stranger to storm, from memory to heartbeat. Then softly she whispered, You don't even know if I can love you back. David's smile was small, but sure. Then I'll wait until you do. That night the storm finally broke. Rain hammered against the glass, and thunder shook the windows. Audrey sat awake in her bed, unable to sleep. Every word he had spoken replayed in her mind, each one more dangerous than the last. Love, family, fight. She pressed her hands against her stomach, feeling the faint flutter of life inside. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered. She didn't hear the door open at first. "You're awake." David's voice came softly from the shadows. She turned, startled. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head. "Neither did I." He stepped closer, his shirt half unbuttoned, his hair damp from the rain. "The power's out in half the house," he said quietly. "I thought you might be scared." "I'm fine," she murmured. But her voice trembled, betraying her. Without a word, he reached for the candle on the nightstand and lit it. The soft flame flickered between them, throwing golden light across their faces. "See?" he said gently. "No darkness lasts forever." Something in her broke then, all the walls, all the fear. She didn't move when he sat beside her. She didn't resist when his hand brushed a strand of hair from her face. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't make promises you can't keep." He looked into her eyes, his expression steady. "I don't make promises. I make choices, and I've already made mine." For a moment, the world seemed to slow the storm outside, fading into a distant hum. Audrey's eyes glistened. "You'll regret this," maybe he said softly. "But I'll regret it more if I let you walk away again." And as the candle burned low, their shadows leaned toward each other, drawn by something neither of them could resist. Not reason, not fear, not even time. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside that quiet room, something far more powerful had begun to take root, a fragile, undeniable love that neither of them could escape anymore. Morning came quietly, after the storm, soft light spilling through the windows like forgiveness. The world outside glistened, every leaf washed clean, every color alive again. Inside the Clark mansion, the silence was different now. Not heavy, not cold, but full, like a house that had finally remembered what warmth felt like. Audrey stood by the window, her fingers resting gently on her belly. The morning light haloed around her, softening the edges of everything, her reflection, her fears, even the uncertain shape of the future. Behind her, the door opened. David's footsteps were slow, almost hesitant. He had changed, not in appearance, but in the quiet way he carried himself now. The arrogance that once defined him had melted into something else, something gentler, something real. "You didn't sleep," he said softly. She smiled faintly without turning. "Neither did you." He came closer, stopping just behind her. "I kept thinking about last night." Her hand stilled against the window pane. And how close I came to losing you again." Audrey turned then, meeting his gaze. "You can't lose something you never truly had." David's jaw tightened, but there was no anger in his eyes, only pain, quiet and raw. "You think I never had you? You had moments of me," she said, her voice calm, steady. "But love isn't built on moments. It's built on trust, and I'm still learning how to trust you." He nodded slowly. "Then let me earn it." Her lips curved bittersweet. "You already are." Weeks passed, and with each one something subtle began to shift. David no longer buried himself in endless meetings or corporate dinners. He spent mornings walking through the garden with her, evenings reading in the sitting room, where the firelight turned everything gold. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but the silence between them was no longer unbearable. It was the kind of silence that felt like understanding. Audrey found herself smiling more often. She had started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. Small sketches of light and color, of ocean skies and baby hands. One afternoon she was working on a watercolor by the balcony when David appeared, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "You missed lunch," he said. She smiled without looking up. "I wasn't hungry." He placed 1 mug beside her, watching her brush move. "What are you painting?" "The view," she murmured, but softer. "The world always looks kinder when you paint it." David's gaze softened. "I think you make the world look kinder, just by being in it." She laughed quietly. "You always know what to say, don't you? Only when it comes to you." Their eyes met, and for a moment everything felt suspended, as if time itself was holding its breath. Then the baby kicked. Audrey gasped softly, her hand flying to her stomach. David froze. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, eyes wide with wonder. He knelt beside her chair, his hand hovering uncertainly. "May I?" She nodded, guiding his palm to where the tiny movement had come from. For a moment nothing, and then there it was again, a faint flutter, a heartbeat beneath his hand. David's breath caught. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with something wordless and infinite. "That's our child." Audrey nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes." He smiled, then a slow, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his soul. "I didn't think it was possible," he said softly, "but for the first time in my life I feel like I'm standing in the right place." Audrey reached out, brushing her fingers across his cheek. "Then don't ever move from it." Months passed, and the city outside turned from autumn gold to winter white. The mansion felt alive again, laughter echoing from rooms that had once only known silence. But the night Audrey went into labor, the calm shattered. It happened just after midnight. A sharp pain tore through her sleep, followed by another stronger. Panic rippled through her body as she called out for help. Within moments, David was there, his face pale but determined. "I'm here," he said, voice shaking slightly as he knelt beside her. "It's okay, Audrey. I've got you." Hours blurred into a haze of pain and chaos. The doctor's voice, the flicker of lights. David's steady hand never leaving hers. "You're doing so well," he whispered, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "Breathe, love. Just breathe." "I can't," she gasped. "It hurts, I know. I know." His voice broke. "But you're the strongest woman I've ever known. You can do this." And then a cry. Tiny, sharp, alive. The sound sliced through the room, like light breaking through a storm. Audrey's eyes flew open, and tears streamed freely down her cheeks. David laughed, a sound half-choked, half-sobbing, as the nurse placed a small, wrinkled bundle in Audrey's arms. "She's beautiful," Audrey whispered. "She's perfect," David said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, tracing a trembling finger over the baby's tiny hand. "Just like her mother." Audrey smiled through her tears. "You're a father now, David Clark." He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And you're everything I never knew I needed." They named her Ella Grace Clark. From the moment she came home, the mansion changed again, softer, warmer. The rooms filled with lullabies, the faint scent of milk and baby powder, and the kind of laughter that healed old wounds. David learned to hold her with hands once meant for business deals and control. Audrey learned to sleep through half the night, trusting the man beside her to take care of what she once thought she'd have to do alone. One evening, a month after Ella's birth, David found Audrey sitting by the fireplace, the baby asleep in her arms. He watched her quietly, the glow of the fire painting her skin in shades of gold and rose. "You look like a miracle," he said softly. She looked up, smiling sleepily. "I feel like one." He came closer, kneeling beside her chair. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what? For coming back. For not giving up on us even when you had every reason to." Audrey's eyes softened. "I almost didn't. But then I realized something." "What?" She glanced down at Ella, then back at him. "You can't run from love, Not when it's the kind that finds you, even when you're hiding. David leaned in, brushing his lips against hers. A kiss that was gentle, deep, and full of everything words couldn't say. When they pulled apart, his voice was low. "You saved me, Audrey Sinclair." She smiled, her hand resting over his. "No, David. We saved each other." The snow outside fell in slow, graceful spirals, that night blanketing the world in quiet peace. Inside the mansion, laughter echoed soft, steady, and real. And as David held his daughter in his arms, watching Audrey smile from across the room, he realized something profound. He had spent his whole life chasing perfection, power, wealth, control, and yet perfection had always been right here, sitting before him, breathing softly in his arms. It wasn't in the empire he built. It was in the life he'd almost lost. Audrey walked over, slipping her hand into his. He looked up at her, his heart swelling with something far greater than gratitude. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "Every day," he admitted. "And I thank God for it, because that one reckless night led me to you." She laughed gently. "You always know what to say." He smiled. "Only when I'm telling the truth." As the firelight flickered and the baby stirred, Audrey rested her head against his shoulder. Together they watched the snow fall. Two souls who had wandered too far from love, only to find it in the unlikeliest place. And in that moment there was no past, no fear, no silence, only the steady rhythm of three hearts beating in perfect time. Because love, when it's real, doesn't demand perfection. It demands courage. And somehow, against all odds, they had both found theirs. If this story touched your heart, even for a moment, remember this. Love doesn't always come when you expect it, nor in the form you imagine. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a storm that changes everything and leaves behind something more beautiful than you ever dreamed possible. Believe in second chances. Believe in imperfect love. Because somewhere out there, someone is still waiting for you.